Okay, good evening. This is Ben Sellers here. Welcome to another episode of Pint and Politics, where we kind of pretend that we're down the pub and having a chat and everything's okay. um, but yeah, we've been doing this since December. I've been really enjoying it. Actually, a lot of really interesting people on. Last week we had Joe Solo and Jess Rich, two songwriters and folk singers and activists. And if you didn't see that, it's definitely worth having a look back. You can check through, and we have all of the episodes. They're logged there on Facebook, but they're also probably easiest to find on YouTube as well. So check that out. We've also been doing this thing where we've been taking Pint and Politics on the road. So we've been going on tour, been in Liverpool and Birmingham. So we'll be doing that again in the next few weeks. And that's always kind of slightly different because kind of talk about the radical history of those areas and so on. So look out for that as well. Tonight I have got a rather strong pint of, I know it doesn't look too appetizing, but it's really nice Mexican cake chili stout. So Dave, if I go off, this is quite strong stuff. So if I sort of veer off a bit towards the end, you'll keep me right.
I'll do my best.
Okay, so tonight I have got Dave Renton. And he's a barrister, lives in London. He's well known for his books on fascism and anti-fascism, including a history of the Anti-Nazi League, which I can heartily recommend, called When We Touch the Sky. It's published a while ago, that now, but it's a brilliant book if you can get a hold of it. Dave describes himself on Twitter as a historian, runner, and anti-fascist. Tonight we're going to be talking about his latest book, which is called Jobs and Homes, Stories of the Law in Lockdown. So that's there it is. Just been published by the Legal Action Group. So we're going to be discussing kind of aspects of that. It's a really interesting book. Been having a read over the weekend and really recommend that people get a hold of it if you can, because it's fascinating, moving, and kind of angering as well, actually, a lot of it. But we'll be talking about that in a minute. But just, yeah, how are you, Dave? How's your weekend been?
Oh, look, it's been absolutely great. I should say I'm on the hard stuff, bottle of Courvoisier tonight, but I'm drinking it very, very slowly, I promise.
That's the first thing, by the way.
It's a gift from my dad. I've just been involved in this really lovely discussion online. I'm in this reading group for kind of lefties and lawyers, and we're trying to talk about some of the theory that got written in the 20s and 30s, which helps you understand what the law is. And it's just lovely because it was other people doing the talks and me just listening. And it was also wonderful because it saved me from having to look on the Guardian website, see if there is still a Labour Party, see who's still talking to who. Fortunately, I've missed all of that. So I'm quite glad I did, frankly.
Yeah. I mean, we actually did a interview. It was 2015, wasn't it? Long time ago, and it feels like a long time ago, on the Corbyn campaign. So I think that was the last time I kind of spoke to you, and I just wondered what your thoughts were on what's happened over the last week. The local election results and things like that. Whether you see that as a predictable consequence of what's happened in the Labour Party over the last year, or what?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, I do just want to say, I mean, you're right that it was an interview back in 2015, but it's worth, if anyone doesn't know this, you weren't interviewing me, I was interviewing you, and it was because of all the extraordinary, brilliant stuff you've done right at the start of the Jeremy for Leader campaign. You know, for people who don't know, the things which gave birth to Momentum and might have even gone on to be something even more ambitious and more exciting than what we got. And I was just fascinated to see what you'd been doing with that. In terms of how I feel, look, we'll get on to the politics of the book. I suppose one of the things I'm trying to get people to see in the book is that we've got a theory of class in this country where basically class is all about what happens to people in the workplace. And so therefore, the North is, by definition, everyone in the North is working class because no one in the North earns as much as people down South. And so therefore you can get this dynamics where people who maybe don't work anymore, maybe didn't have that great jobs where they did, are just defined as being poor. And if they're poor, why aren't they voting for Labour? One of the things I'm trying to do with the book is to try and get people to understand class isn't just about jobs. It's also about housing. And it's also about the relationship between jobs and housing. And if you do that, then you can start to see some of the dynamics that we've seen in the last election. It seems to me, areas where with relatively high home ownership, voting Conservative. I'm trying to explain why, those things shouldn't be a surprise, actually. Those social dynamics have been built in for a while. And they're just, that dynamic which is helping the Conservatives. What we've seen last week is just continuation of things which were there before Corbyn, before Miliband. They've been there for perhaps 30 years. Whereas on the other hand, I suppose if you look at the election, you're also starting to see places which have, never been Labour areas actually turning towards Labour in much larger numbers than ever before. And again, trying to see that and not just sort of getting away from this idea that, everyone down south is rich, everyone up north is poor. Things are more complicated than that. And things are also, some of the dynamics, we know how to work them, are more optimistic than that as well. Hopefully we'll get to that.
Yeah, I mean, I've one of the things I've been reading as well as your book actually is I don't know if you know Hugh Bainan, the kind of historian of the miners and particularly Durham miners, and he's got a new book out actually, which is kind of tracing the reasons for not just the Brexit vote, but the whole kind of Red Wall scenario and working class people voting Tory in the North and so on, and it takes it right back, and it's really fascinating. I mean, it kind of brought home to me how those fractures and so on started really kind of emerging with Harold Wilson and the Labour Party in the 60s and the white heat of technological revolution and things, which then the old industries kind of being left behind. So and then you had the Thatcher period, which kind of really reinforced some of that and trying to turn us into a kind of more service economy, which had a big that was kind of like underlying thing. And then obviously New Labour didn't do an awful lot to kind of halt or reverse any of those things. So the people quite often kind of talk about, they talk about campaigns, they talk about what did we do wrong in 2019, and I do think it's important to discuss that, but or was 2017 a blip, and seeing things in very kind of electoral terms, and actually these things have kind of a lot deeper roots, don't they?
Yeah, look, totally. And even, you've gone back there to the 60s. I mean, in another life, I was a Labour historian, and I was, the period I began with was the 19th century. And it really wasn't as simple as just the Tories wrote off the North. I mean, even loads of the big cities, I think Liverpool, we now think of as probably kind of the jewel in Labour's crown. I mean, it had Tory MPs until the 20s. Yeah. There were all sorts of cultures which enabled quite a lot of northern constituencies to vote for themselves, sometimes for 50, 60, 70 years. Look, I don't really want to get too much into. I agree with your big point, which is just if you're in the Labour Party, you see everything as a matter of like performance. Did our candidates have a good message? Did they get it across well? And it's not difficult to see that, for example, the current leader is a terrible performer. You might, even if you agreed with him politically, people could probably accept he's a terrible performer, and that's not helped. But I do think that there's a kind of myth making that's going on, a kind of it's far better not just to turn around and say, oh yeah, millions of people are going to vote for us, we don't need to do that much. Far more useful is to have a bit of sense that those cultures which created the Red Wall were the product of people fighting for a Labour vote and fighting for socialist politics. If you bring that back, there's an awful lot of ground that we've lost that we could win back. But if you just treat people like fodder or a crop waiting to be harvested, then of course they're going to get fed up with you in the end.
Yeah. Just before we kind of move on to discussing the book a bit more in detail, because I, as I say, I've been reading it over the weekend, and there's still chapters that I need to go back to and read. But it's really like, as I say, quite a moving book. But I want to talk about that. But one thing about kind of, I know you're a big runner, aren't you? Are you still running?
I am. Look, you asked about that, and I very deliberately dodged it earlier. On Saturday, I was part of. I'm in a club in London called the Mornington Chasers. We were set up out of basically the big postal sorting office that's just south of Euston, and the people there. It was originally first generation of Irish runners. They're all in their 80s now, and it's sort of bit by bit passed on to a kind of London generation now in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. So I'm actually one of the old ones, and I was doing a 3K yesterday, and they're the photos of it on the internet, and I just look, I look so slow. It's shocking. But yeah, no. When I was a kid, I was a very, very serious runner, and I'm a barrister, and most barristers are quite posh. I'm quite posh. Through a whole bunch of quite, being a lefty in quite hostile, posh circumstances. The truth was that running was something which kept me going. It gave me a sense of all sorts of collectivities. This wasn't that long after Co and Yvette, and that was a class struggle. If anything was a class struggle, that whole rivalry. And so running was a big part for me of becoming a lefty in my teens. Surrounded by places where you couldn't talk politics, you couldn't talk to people, and it was one of the places in life where I got a real sense of freedom.
Yeah, because the reason why I asked about that is because I've never ever I've played football all my life, and I've got rheumatoid arthritis actually, so I had to kind of give that up. Too much twisting and turning and things, but I discovered running about, through lockdown, and me and Laura Pidcock were talking about this because she also has started running, and there is kind of quite a big kind of mental health side to running, isn't there? Like, and I'd never ever thought that before. To me, running was always about pain and about just something functional to get you maybe fit, so you play football or whatever, or just be healthy. But I've actually, there was a point, and I've gone backwards a bit actually in the last few months because I had a bit of a back injury. But there was a point in sort of kind of October, November, December time when I was kind of starting to really enjoy it and fly, and as I was running along, I was thinking this is really nice, and also afterwards that feeling of relaxation because you've switched off for that time, and I think for people involved in politics, stuff like that probably is quite useful, isn't it, to have that kind of valve?
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, I find that when I run and when I'm running well, and one of the tough things having run at quite high standard is that the older you get, your chances to run well by definition going to be fewer and fewer. But when I run well, it's the best feeling in the world, and I'm sure that during the lockdown, lots and lots of people have taken up running for that sense of just to get out of the house, to get a bit of greenery back in your life, just to look up and see the sky a bit. I do want to say that for if you have been getting into it, one of the extraordinary things about running is that so much of running sociability is through clubs, through things like park runs. They're going to be starting up again, I think, sometime in the next 3 or 4 weeks. And, you get these sort of voluntary movements completely done without any spending money, without any spending cash, without any sponsors, completely free of all the normal crap of capitalism. And you just get these voluntary things with hundreds of thousands of people going out and running together. And if you've enjoyed running on your own, I really would urge you or anyone else listening to think about, not necessarily can join your clubs. That's quite a big step. But finding out when the park runs start again, whether there's one near you, whether you can do that, because to my mind, it takes up another level when that feeling of the weekend's coming round, you're not just going to be running with yourself, you're going to be running places where there can be kids too, and you can be running as part of a group. And for me, that's such a wonderful motivation. And it's something that I've really missed during lockdown. You know, I've mainly played football with my kid. I run a bit, but what makes me run is that feeling that I'm part of a community of people running together. That again, something that's really important for me.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to have you back on. We could probably talk about running for maybe get Laura on as well. Become running bores, you know. But we need to talk about the book because I think it's really important. It's a fantastic book, and I just wondered, firstly, like what made, I know you've written, you know, you've got, I was looking through on your Google Books list this morning, and you know, the hell of a lot you've written in your lifetime. But what made you, this is different from any of the other ones, so what made you write this one?
Yeah, look, I mean, most of the books I've been written have been about history. They've been about fascism and anti-fascism and subjects that kind of spin off from that's been the core. But I've been a barrister for about 13 years. I just wanted to write about the people I represent. In my day job, I represent people who, essentially, people who are threatened with losing their home and people who are threatened with losing their job. And I represent them, and I go before court, and we're trying to find ways to save their homes and saving their job, or more often in the tribunal, trying to get them compensation for losing their job, but often even before they've lost it. And I just wanted to try and write a book that was a chance to talk about their lives, their experiences, their struggles in the court system, to use that as a kind of way in to try and talk about Britain as a whole, the moment that we're at, where we've got to politically. And you know, I had certain models when I first came into the movement. And you know, I'm 48, so that's a long time ago. It's 30 years ago. There was this book that just been written by an East End doctor called Dave Widgery, and it's called Some Lives. And in theory, it's just a book about all the patients he sees every day and what's happening in their lives. But it's not a book about, I don't know, eczema or asthma. It's a book about what it's like to live in the East End. And in the same way, I think my book's about what it's like to be right now if you're one of those tenants who, you know, for whatever reason, you've got a landlord who really doesn't care. They just want the rent money to come in. They're not at all fussed about getting you out. They don't care if you'll ever get a job again, ever get home again. They're not fussed. What it's like being in that situation and having to navigate through a court system, which, you know, you can get some victories in, but fundamentally isn't there to help you and isn't fundamentally there to help you sort out your problems.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the kind of unusual things about it is that you wouldn't normally get a lawyer kind of writing this sort of these kind of narratives and so on. So I think what I found really useful from it is because I think you bring alive, you know, people in a very kind of, you know, over a couple of paragraphs, you can visualize, you know, what it's like to be that person. And I know it must have been quite difficult to do that very succinctly, because there's obviously a load of backstory and you get to know these people and so on. But I mean, has anybody ever done anything like this before?
I don't know. I mean, like in the law, it's really rare. I mean, you know, you go to a bookshop, you find books and books of memoirs by doctors, by nurses, by teachers, by lots of people. But there are various reasons with lawyers why we don't like doing it. I mean, an obvious one, yeah. I mean, I've got a duty of confidentiality to my clients. So I had to spend hours and hours and hours thinking with each story, how can I absolutely make sure that, number one, I've conveyed to the readers exactly what this person's life is like and their situation. But number two, if my client read it, they couldn't come back and say, hey, wait a second.
Yeah.
Because some of the clients I'm talking about are clients who, you know, for example, are dead.
Yeah.
You know, some clients I was able to talk to say, are you happy with how I put you in this book? But quite a lot of them, I didn't have that option. So it's obvious with clients, but it wasn't just clients, because a lot of the book's about other relationships. It's about court staff. It's about my opponents in court. And, you know, I work in a world where there aren't that many barristers who represent landlords predominantly. So again, I had to think really, really hard. You know, if I say this about one particular person, how do I know that I'm not going to see them in court in 2 weeks and they're going to give me a kick the moment they see me, or give my client a kick in court, which would be even worse. And of course, the other people I had to think about was judges. I really tried to get the balance right between being very clear and very, very truthful, that all the things I described in that book have happened in real life, while at the same time being, covering my tracks as hard as I could to make sure that if I had a judge on the other side of the desk, they wouldn't go, Mr. Renton, I've got page 56 here. Why the hell did you let that go in there? So it's been quite a balance, and I think that's why it's not been done. I mean, the one thing possibly that I did reread, which I know maybe some of the people listening read, would be the Rumpole stories.
Yeah.
Because of course the guy who wrote them, John Mortimer, I mean, he was a lefty. He was in the Labour Party for decades. He was even in the Communist Party when he was a kid. I think when he wrote that book, it's pretty unmistakable. There's certain points which really have the ring of truth about them, and he did that through fiction, of course. But I'm trying to do something similar, I hope, but in a kind of more memoir-y, supposedly non-fictional sort of style.
Yeah. And one thing that struck me was when I was reading it was you mentioned that you had experience as a trade union, branch secretary, weren't you, before this, and representing people and so on. And I did a bit of that for the GMB for about a year when I was working in the bookshop, and I was doing part-time work for the GMB, kind of going out and representing particularly people in care homes, and also as the staff as well. And it strikes me that, I mean, I obviously had no experience of what it must be like to be a barrister or a lawyer or solicitor, but it's sort of some of the things that you were saying, some of the frustrations, some of the kind of your function in all of this feels very similar to that kind of trade union role, and then there's that kind of human element, and I just kind of wondered as well, I mean, obviously you've got your kind of left wing barristers and people we know. We were talking about Liz Davis before, and people like that. I mean, you'd expect them to have kind of like that understand that human side and everything, but could you do that? Could you do this job without feeling that?
I think you can, but I don't think you could do it well. I remember really early on, before I did a lot of housing law, I was a real baby barrister. I did a mixture of employment and family. And a lot of the family cases I did were just battles between two estranged parents about where a kid would live and how much of the day of each week the kid would spend with each parent. I vividly remember one of my early opponents. We were having an argument, and it was basically about which parent the kid would live with. So for both the estranged parents, this was the most important thing that happened in their lives, maybe ever. And they were fighting to bits about it. And I remember getting my barrister opponent to sit down. We're talking about what we can do. And my client wanted this and his client wanted that. And I remember him saying to me at one point, "You know what? You can have it. I don't care." I went, "What?" He said, "If we were fighting about anything important, I'd stand up for my guy. But this is just about kid. If this was 10 grand, it was something that mattered." And I wanted to hit him.
Wow.
He was giving my client what he wanted. But the attitude he had towards his own client was just terrible. Yeah. It was like, no, these are people's lives. This matters so much to them. If you're going to fight for someone, you've got to respect their case. They paid you to respect their case, and that's your attitude when no one's listening.
Yeah,
I know. I just found it absolutely shocking. I mean, and the truth is, even in housing and employment, from time to time, I come across people as representatives who just really shouldn't be there. Perhaps because they're too aggressive, perhaps because they're too passive, perhaps because they just don't really understand what's actually. And again, I think one of the little motives I had in writing the book, I was pretty hopeful that one of the people who'd read it would be a kind of new generation of lawyers who maybe they're doing their legal training and so on, and maybe that they'd get a sense of how much is at stake for people when they lose their jobs or their homes, and they'd think about that and they'd try and integrate it into their barristering, because again, one of the most important things you want in a case actually is a decent opponent, not necessarily as a barrister. It doesn't have to mean somebody who agrees with you on everything, because obviously then if that life's not that easy. But you want someone who understands it, and that will really help your client. And likewise, I like to think that although I'm representing, tenants and employees, I do sometimes think, I'm always quite alive, I think, to the kind of conflicts you get on the legal team and behind the legal team on the other side. If you can get a dynamic, for example, where you've got say an employment tribunal, you're up against this big business, all the managers are lined up, but one of the managers is willing to speak out a bit, and you can bring out those sorts of conflicts on the other side. Again, that's an absolutely lovely dynamic to get into, both for your client, but also just for the sake of actually getting to the truth of what happened, getting to the right answer for what should be done.
Could just sort of turn into the case studies that you talk about. They're not case studies. I think that's far too formal. I mean, you're telling the stories of people's lives, and in a really kind of, I think, really sympathetic way. Are there kind of one or two that kind of stick in your mind that you could kind of give us a flavour of, that are kind of emblematic of the kind of things that you're talking about here, so, and with jobs and housing?
Well, if I just give one, it's a story I tell early on in the book, and it was about a particular tenant called Ronald, and he was in his early 70s. He was a guy who'd come over to England, I don't know, 40, 50 years before. He'd actually worked, bizarrely enough, on the Carry On films. He had all these stories about falling in love with Hattie Jakes and all that sort of stuff. But what happened to him, the reason why he was faced with losing his home, he lived in a big council block, and his neighbours had absolutely set against him because he had a dog, Guinness, who was a staffy, and he just couldn't control Guinness. My client Ronald, he was an alcoholic. He couldn't walk Guinness enough, so Guinness was in the flat, it was a small flat every day, howling and howling every day of the night. And I tell the story, and the reason why I've chosen it now, I want to tell you about it, is because there's some layers to it. The first, most basic, just what happened to Ronald and Guinness. And the shortest version is Ronald was threatened with losing his home because he couldn't control Guinness. Ronald refused to give up Guinness because he himself had a young lad who died tragically in a road accident. He needed to have someone in his life to love, and that became for him his dog. So he wouldn't give up Guinness, and even though all the neighbours were complaining about it. So possession order was made, then there was warrants and eviction. We got that suspended. We got it suspended actually because his solicitor, was a lovely woman called Sue, went to court, and she made a promise. We call it an undertaking to the court. And she promised that she would make sure that Guinness was rehoused. And this was an enormous thing for a solicitor to do, because the point of the promise was if she hadn't done it, then she could go to jail. And I don't think there are many solicitors in the country who'd get up and say before court, yeah, I'm so determined to help my client out that I'll do this practical thing he can't do. And if not, I'll be the one who goes to jail. So it's a story which lawyers have often told, and we kind of always end it there, and it ends with a victory. But and lots of people told the story. Sue's told it in various places and such like. But what I wanted to do with the book is sort of wind the tape on a bit to go on to what happens next. And the first most basic thing that happened next was that actually, although Sue took Guinness away, Ronald couldn't live without his dog. So Guinness came back, he lost his home. Guinness ended up being taken away by an animal charity. We found a new home for Guinness, but Ronald, we didn't. He was sleeping rough. Within a matter of a few weeks, he was taken to hospital and died. Now, the reason I wanted to tell that story and have it so early in the book is because as lawyers, we go and we fight our battle, and there's always this just assumption on the other side. Oh, yeah. If we get someone out, if they sleep off, it's all right. They'll be all right. Someone will intervene. The welfare state will come in and help out. But actually, there isn't a welfare state like that anymore. There hasn't been for quite a long time. No one came to help him. And again, I represent people who are just in as bad and a final last resort situation as Ronald. But there is another layer still, which is that I was doing a talk a couple of weeks ago, and similar to this, and told the story, and the solicitor Sue was in the room. She actually told me something which I hadn't known when I wrote the book, which is that after Ronald died, she was the only person who knew what was first. So she ended up being the person who took his ashes away at the end of the cremation and things like that. So she was there at the service, and he was there with a couple of his mates who he'd drunk with, and that's all right. And there's this woman who came in who's sitting all by herself. And at the end, Sue goes up and asks the woman, "Who are you? Is there a member of the family we didn't know about?" And she wasn't a member of the family. She was the neighbour who'd complained against Ronald so many times, given 5 different statements to the court to say he had to be evicted. So Sue says, "Well, what on earth happened? How did you fall out?" And this tenant said, "We didn't fall out. I loved him. He was my best friend in the estate. His dog barked, my dog barked. They loved each other. If only he'd had access to lawyers, then maybe he wouldn't have lost him. I kept on telling him, go and see a lawyer." And this tenant had a story in her head that she was the good person. She'd been fighting for Ronald, even if in reality she'd been doing all in her power to evict him. So there's a couple more layers still, I think, if you think about it. One is that, someone wrote something. I said, "Look, Dave, your philosophy is like, just don't be," I think you used the word scunner. There's probably a different word. There's possibly a ruder one. But that's my philosophy of life. Just don't be a creep. Don't be an idiot. If you're in a collective situation like housing, don't make life hard for the other people around you. And that's kind of, I suppose, the philosophy of the book. But also you need to understand, why is it that tenants, because in antisocial behaviour complaints, a lot of the cases I do, actually tenants do over complain. They dob each other in. They report each other to the landlord. They actually sometimes make life hell for each other. It's worth trying to, again, have a bit of a sense of the bigger picture. Well, why do they do that? And part of the answer is actually in our society, if you're a tenant in a housing association, a local authority home, a landlord, a lot of homes, but you've just got one of them, you've got no right whatsoever to say, "I want to be moved." I want to be moved because my neighbour's a bit of a creep. I want to be moved because actually my neighbour's not that much of a creep, but we've just fallen out and it's too far gone, we can't rescue him. I want to move because actually you've not got decent sound insulation between the flats. And really, no one's particularly to fault, but we need sound insulation and you won't pay for it. So now move them. There are lots of different reasons why tenants would have a really good reason to move. And just landlords always say no. Always, always, always say no. And that's why we sometimes get these dynamics like Ronald's, with the kind of neighbour forced to make their other neighbour sound like he's the worst person in the world. It's not because they're a bad person, but it's because we thought through a system. We've made housing so bloody expensive, so something you've got to hold on to so hard, that actually that creates dynamics where people can treat to each other really badly in ways that they won't admit to themselves what they're doing. So sorry, that's a bit of a long story, but I hope it conveys some of the kind of balances and the rights and the wrongs and the complexities of the stories I'm trying to tell in the book.
Yeah, and there's a few things there. I mean, one is what you mentioned there about the lack of a safety net, and that assumption amongst, the legal profession, that some in the legal profession that there just will be, and there is. And I kind of wondered what you thought about whether that is a political divide, that people in the legal profession, people who are involved like you are in kind of wider activism and linked to left-wing politics would understand that, but others wouldn't. And then I suppose the other side of that is the kind of the harsh environment of housing, and as you say, and also kind of local authority attitudes of the lack of flexibility there, and a kind of like it's a very harsh world for people, especially people that have problems, whether it's alcoholism or mental health, problems. I just wonder what you thought about that.
Well, I think just on the first question, I think maybe it's easier to answer that. One of the things that's definitely a feature of my practice is that, to get to be a barrister, it's a very, very class hierarchical system. For example, when students want to do a law degree, anyone in the world can do a law degree, and loads of working class students do law degrees. But there are all sorts of things. If you want to be a barrister, someone whose only involvement in courts is that you're doing the advocacy, which is kind of the glamorous bit. If you want to be one of them, there's so many different ways that's just closed off to working class students. When we're a very lefty set, we're a very multiracial set. We're probably the most diverse chambers in Britain. But even when people apply to us, it's absolutely typical for a really good law candidate to say, over the last 2 years, I've spent 400-500 hours of my life volunteering for judges, for causes, for charities, for all these different things, and we just expect it. We think anyone who's going to be good enough to be a barrister at that stage of life, they'll have already done all those volunteers. Now, who can do that? Who doesn't have the support of mum and dad, who's willing to say, all right, we're willing to let you work 2 years, 3 years unpaid on top of all your studying to build up the contacts, the social capital that enables you to get into the profession. But if that's what we do, we turn around and say, like, only certain people can be lawyers. And we have all these subtle processes that weed out the vast majority of people. What then happens when those lawyers become judges, or when they become a lawyer who's supposed to represent someone? They've got no idea what it's like. And they're just the things that you sort of hear all the time, that just reflect a kind of not just a middle class assumption that there's some safety net. I don't know what it is, but there must be some safety net. Obviously, these people are going to be all right. But even kind of middle class assumptions about how people live. That I know that if you're in a tower block and people ring on the doorbell and there's a lot of noise because of that, this is so shocking and such a terrible thing and so unusual and so rare that it's practically criminal. And if anyone should happen that tower block, then anyone who might have any relationship to the kids who do that, they've just got to be evicted because that crosses the line. And it's like, well, I've lived in tower blocks. Quite a lot of time people have to put up with a whole bunch of stuff. But if you've got a legal system that's designed to create a kind of monoculture of who's there, then of course people don't get it, and of course they just fall into basic decisions, which in the end are just whatever the managers of a bit of property want. In the end, they can get.
And what about the kind of attitudes? Because you mentioned the bedroom tax as well. I mean, so central and local government, has there been a kind of like hardening, or has that always been there? So it's hard for people to, as you say, kind of move, but also you've got the bedroom tax on the other hand, forcing people to move when they don't want to.
Look, I think there's definitely been a hardening, but I don't think it's just the bedroom tax. When austerity happened, there were about 6 or 7 different benefits changes which all came in at once, and they all had the same basic effect. And it's at its simplest form, it's basically this: in the old days, almost everyone who was on housing benefit had 100% of their rent paid. And these days, if you're on housing benefit, and we all know there's lots of different ways you can get on housing benefit, or the housing element of universal credit. It's effectively the same thing. These days, if you're on housing benefit, the chances are you don't get the whole rent paid. Chances are you might get half or 2/3 of it paid. So that means that for millions and millions of people, they're just short on their rent. Now, you asked, is there a hardening of attitudes? There is, but there's a reason why there's a hardening of attitude, which is if you're a local authority housing officer, there was a time when £200 or £300 arrears sounded quite a lot of money. Whereas in London these days, if you're a local authority housing officer and they're people with £20,000 or £30,000 arrears, that's no longer unusual. That's something that's relatively normal. So there's a hardening of attitudes, but you could say from the point of view of these institutions, the councils which are bureaucratized, the housing associations which are in hoc to the banks, from their perspective, all they're doing is they're trying desperately to keep hold of their money, which they've kind of got to, otherwise the whole thing will collapse. So from their perspective, they say, it's not a hardening of hearts, it's just us being pragmatic. But from the point of view of lots of tenants, it's like, whoa, you're just sending out automated letters. You're not interested in what I'm saying. You're just determined to get me out the first time I get into any sort of trouble at all.
And then just thinking about evictions and what, because there's been an awful lot of, press coverage of evictions, and there's been campaigning around it, and it's good that it's been highlighted during COVID. But I was just thinking in terms of, what sort of scale of problem was there before COVID, and how has that been impacted by the pandemic as well?
Well, there's 2 different things. There's how much tenancy debt is there, and how many people are being evicted. Tenancy debt, i.e. people owing money to their landlords, has definitely gone massively up. And, for really simple reasons. There was a moment last summer when the number of people claiming universal credit went up like pressing a button, from 2 million people to 8 million. Now that's vast numbers of people just lost their jobs, so obviously they're going to be behind with their rent. And we know lots of things have happened as a result. Every 3 days it feels like the Guardian runs a version of this story. It says we've done a survey, 500,000 people, 700,000 people, however many, have had letters from their landlord threatening to evict them. But the other side of this, which is kind of weird and which the papers never properly report, is that so far the actual number of evictions is lower than it was pre-pandemic. Right now, it's about a quarter of what it was pre-pandemic. And not even evictions. Evictions are below a quarter. I'm talking about landlords going to court and asking for evictions is down about 3/4 compared to pre-pandemic.
Right.
And it's really, no one's really got a decent explanation for why it is. Probably the best explanation is this, that we're still in a situation where officially all bail estates, so all evictions, are on hold till after the pandemic. And that's going to last till the end of this month. And it seems that what's happened is basically landlords have taken a cue from that. All that did was it got rid of evictions. It didn't get rid of anything else. It didn't get rid of, the landlord can't evict you without going to court. The landlord can still go to court. The landlord can still ask for a possession order. All of these are way down, but it feels like landlords have basically just assumed as long as that's in place, there's no point in them even asking for anything because they just won't get it. So the kind of nightmare scenario is that goes at the end of this month, which it will, and then all of those 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 people that the landlords can threaten to evict will just be evicted. That's kind of the nightmare scenario. Probably that's what the figures still suggest, but we do all have to be honest. I mean, there'll be people listening to this who, or watching this, who are involved with Momentum and groups like that have been doing all sorts of eviction training, or there are housing action campaigns and other things which have been doing eviction training. All they're noticing is nothing's really happening just yet. And I want to say to anyone who's in that situation, who's listening to that, that actually is the big picture. We're still talking about like a disaster which could happen rather than something really bad which has started. Yeah.
So, I mean, there is likely to be a huge spike when the eviction ban ends, or we come out of lockdown. And what do you think about campaigns to stop evictions in practically, physically? Are they effective? Are they? I know, as you say, Momentum have been talking about that. I don't know where we are with that, but would you say that that's kind of useful activism?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, if you take a tenants union like, say, Acorn, which is one of the largest ones and one of the best known ones, and kind of predates things like Momentum's involvement in it. They do mass collective blockades to stop evictions, to protect someone's home, and when bailiffs are due to court, and that's something that's important. To my mind, it sends a really strong visual, symbol that here is a whole community standing together and to support someone who's threatened with losing their home. And undoubtedly, that has been really positive and saved people's tenancies. But to my mind, the most useful things that Acorn and those sorts of tenants unions do isn't that, even if that's the thing which gets into the headlines. The most important thing is just tenants talking and organising, getting a sense of their rights, sharing information, realising that we do still have a bunch of laws that go back to the 70s that, for example, make it a criminal offence for a landlord to evict you without going to court first. Do, for example, give tenants all sorts of rights to repairs in the home. Homes have to be fit for human habitation. There are all these rights which every day landlords try and pretend don't exist. Rights to get your deposit back, rights to get quite a hefty fine for landlords if they haven't properly protected your deposits. So tenants' unions are a chance for people to share their knowledge of these rights and to enforce them without necessarily having to do the really big, high-profile blockade the street stuff. And I'm a huge fan, and I want those to flourish. And I think it's really quite interesting seeing how they sort of copied some of the learning that trade unions have gone through and applied it to a different situation.
And one of the things sort of with the book is that it really tells quite the um, the story of lockdown from the sharp end. So you know I mean, reading it, I think a review that you mentioned had said that you'd end up kind of shaking your fist as well. So put your coffee mug down. I think that's true, though. I suppose, and what I'm kind of wondering is, what do you see as the kind of purpose? You mentioned, young legal trainees coming in and reading that and understanding the kind of wider issues around the stories that you tell. Um, um, do you think that? I mean, obviously you could take this as a kind of profoundly depressing read as well. But what do you see as the kind of sort of underlying purpose of it?
Well, I really hope people don't read that and get depressed by it, not the whole way through. Because there's a lot of organisation in the book, there's a lot of struggle in the book, and there are a lot of victories in the book.
Mm.
But if I had to give someone, the best one single reason why they should read it and not feel depressed at all, it's this. One of the things I'm trying to talk about is what's happening right now in Britain in terms of the politics of home ownership, renting, land ownership, landlordism. And because my very strong belief is that if our movements got this a bit better, we could actually win. And there's a very specific point I make about the rise of Corbynism and the eclipse of Corbynism. What I say if you look at Corbyn's relative success in the 2017 election, how he got it was that vast numbers of people who are tenants voted for him. If you look at where Labour's vote picked up between 2015 and 2017, almost all the rise amongst people who rent. And I don't have the figures to hand, but by the end, Labour's lead amongst people who rented was enormous. It was almost as big as their lead amongst, say, health workers. It was something like 63% lead, i.e. 1 in 5 voters who rented voted Tory, and all the rest, more or less, were voting Labour. Now, you got to that situation because Corbyn was the first candidate in decades who spoke about tenants, understood tenants, and got that they're getting, whether we're talking about private sector tenants, housing association, council tenants, he got there are a whole bunch of things they need. And he spoke to those people and they responded to him. But what I'm trying to say in my book is that if you look back at that political moment, there was also there was a weakness in Corbynism, which I don't think anyone else has ever spoken about. And it goes like this. Even if a party can maximise the votes of tenants to the extent that Corbyn and the Labour Party did, the practical reality is that the majority of people in this country own their own homes. And the problem with Labour being perceived as the party of renters, but not the party of homeowners, was you've got this kind of fight to the battle between tenants and homeowners. And the Tories were able to say, we're the party of homeowners, we're a majority. And by appealing to them, they were able to win. Now, one of the things I'm trying to say in the book is you could break apart that Tory unanimity if you could get homeowners to see, at least some homeowners to see, that they have different interests from the private landlords who are making so many tenants' lives hell. And I talk a lot in the book about how we've got a kind of loaded housing market that means that, every time a new home is built, it's something like 4 times as likely to go to someone who's already a landlord as it is to someone who doesn't own a home now and wants to buy a home. There are all sorts of ways our housing market is set up, which massively stacks it in the favour of people, landlords, buying to let, letting out tens, hundreds of properties, really not caring one little bit if they make a huge sum of money and their tenants are miserable as hell. Now, one of the things it seemed to me that I think the Labour Party could have been much sharper at was talking to groups of homeowners. Like, for example, just imagine that you are, and think about, say, Hartlepool. Quite a lot of the people in Hartlepool who own their own homes, 60% of voters in Hartlepool own their own homes. A lot of them would have kids. Those kids might not be in Hartlepool, but those kids would be people who themselves effectively have no prospect of ever getting a home themselves except through their parents dying. So we've got this completely warped and twisted dynamic where the older generation is saving like hell for the sake of a younger generation who are never going to see the benefit until after their parent dies. And if the Labour Party could talk about some of those dynamics, could get a bunch of homeowners to see that actually intergenerational justice and solidarity means changing the way the rules of the housing market is rigged, getting away from this landlordism type system. That's in their interest too. If only we could get a whole bunch of homeowners to see that, and you could get people sort of thinking about solidarity in intergenerational terms, that might be one of the dynamics which could turn things around. And you could start imagining again a majority made up of tenants plus a significant group of homeowners. So that's why I think the book's optimistic, because it's trying to talk about how the politics of housing could actually be a route towards re-establishing a Labour majority.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Hartlepool, actually, because I was just going to ask you about sort of geographical dimension of this. So, we obviously aware that issues around renters and so on is a huge issue in London. I'm just thinking about it feels like there's less of a discussion around that in the north and so on. So is that actually based in kind of material reality as well?
I don't know. It's kind of difficult because there's two different things that are going on. One is it's definitely the case there is still more social housing in parts of the north. I've lived in Liverpool, I've lived very briefly in Newcastle, and a bit in Sunderland. I've lived in Nottingham, if you count that as the north. It is the case that some of the places I've just mentioned, when I talk to housing officers, they'd say things like, okay, if you're a single person, there's no way you'll ever get a council house, but if there's two of you, if you've got a kid, actually, we do have some properties and it is possible to get on the ladder. And you'd have conversations with people which are different from what they are in London. I mean, I don't think there's a council left in London which has got a waiting list of less than 20,000 people. But there are also some things in the north which are actually worse than London. I mean, one of the things you find is, particularly in some of the county councils, you find local authorities who've got an obligation to house all the homeless people in a certain area, and actually they don't have a single unit of council-owned housing anymore because they went through various bits of sell-off, let it all go to housing associations, and then the local authorities, when they're faced with families in real need, they're just on the phone going, "Can you house?" And housing associations saying, "No, we're not interested. We can't." The other really, really big difference that I was really conscious of when I was writing the book between London and you can say the north, but frankly you can say anywhere in Britain, is that in London we still have legal aid, we still have quite a developed ecology of law centres, of solicitors who are good at running legal aid cases. And it's often my experience when I do cases in county courts outside London, I'll meet a district judge and he'll say, "What, you're on legal aid? You're representing your client on legal aid?"
Yeah.
And I go, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I haven't seen a legal aid lawyer in my courtroom for 6 months." And, it might be that one of the things which is going is one of the reasons why we do talk about housing more in London. It's not just that there's kind of particular acute needs, but there's actually just a whole bunch of people whose job is to find out there's a need, to offer a legal solution to it. And I'd be lying if I pretended that, I know what's going on in parts of the northeast where, places where you've had court closures and people are now 50 minutes by bus from their nearest county court. And all the grapevine you hear back is that even like tenants threatened eviction half the time don't even attend court. If trying to generalize from that, you'd need people who are much closer to that story than I am, to be honest about what things are actually like.
Yeah. What about the government's response to crisis in housing and with renters and arrears and evictions and so on? What were your an impression of that? I mean, it feels like they've been absolutely dragged kicking and screaming, and really their initial reaction was to try and protect homeowners, people with mortgages, and really only the renters kind of issue, was forced on them by, by campaigning and by people kicking up a fuss. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it was the last 6 questions which Corbyn asked at question time of Boris Johnson when he was Labour leader. 2 of the 6 were about housing, and that was hours before you got the significant Tory concessions. And the government's concessions were to hold off on evictions till the end of the lockdown. Now that's actually been good. I won't lie, it's much better that they did that. In the same way that it's far better that we've had furlough for workers rather than not having anything. The problem is really this, that and I don't go over things that we talked about earlier, but essentially it's this. At the end of the lockdown, the housing market will not be what it was before the lockdown started. If only because millions of people lost their jobs, went through a long period where they didn't have enough money to get by, and are now in significant rent arrears. A whole bunch of our housing laws are designed around a different system where actually getting into debt with your landlord is relatively rare. I'll just give one example, which has been driving a lot of housing lawyers spare. For private landlords and for housing associations, you can evict a tenant under what we call ground 8, which is when a tenant is 8 weeks in arrears. And the idea is that's such an unusual and high amount of arrears that there couldn't be any possible explanation for how someone could be that far in debt. 8 weeks. Well, I don't know. I don't know how many tenants in Britain right now are in 8 weeks arrears, but I'd certainly give a hunch that it's in excess of 200,000 people. It's not unusual at all anymore. It's for a whole bunch of it's the new normal. So we've got housing laws based on assumption about access to debt advice, access to benefits, speed of granting benefits, and so on, which is all decades out of date. The depressing thing is the government hasn't done anything about it, and we're coming to quite a key moment, I think, which is that on Tuesday we're going to have the Queen's speech. Now, when the Conservatives stood in the 2019 election, one of the things they promised was there'd be a renters reformers bill which would abolish Section 21, which is the main way private landlords get tenants out. And if that was abolished, that would be a huge step forward. They promised in the election they'd do it. They promised in the first Queen's speech in winter 2019 they'd do it. For about 6 months, they've been quiet as anything about this. And it really wouldn't surprise me if we listened to the Queen's speech and find out they just dropped this promise and they're no longer they're no longer planning to get rid of Section 21. And I think if that happens, that to my mind will be the next big battle. This is something they've said, they've promised, they put it in their manifesto. And I'm really quite expecting that we're going to have to fight like hell to make sure they actually do it.
And towards the end of the book, you talk about some remedies and solutions, and I was just thinking, what you talked about the government there. What about the Labour Party? What about their response, and what are the things that they should be saying about this?
Well, the first and most basic thing, one of the things I talk about in the book, and I was relatively coded at the book because I wrote the book 6 months ago. That's what happens with books. You write them 6 months ago, then you wait for them to be actually printed. So I was relatively muted there. But one of the things I talk about is the experience of talking to the shadow housing minister and trying to get her to see what was going on with housing. And the first most basic thing that I think from meeting her, and she's someone who, very similar politically to the current leader of the Labour Party. The first most basic thing I was saying to her was stop seeing this just about homeowners. You've got to start from the needs of tenants. It doesn't matter whether it's private sector tenants, housing association, local authority. There's just something like 9 million tenant households. It's getting on for, something like 15 million people in Britain rent. So start off. You've just got to be much more vocal about their needs and just understand their needs in a way that I think very few people in the current Labour front that do understand them. But yeah, then the second thing is the point that I've already made to you in this chat, which is, but there has to be a dialogue with homeowners too. But but it's got to be the right sort of dialogue. One that talks about intergenerational solidarity, one that talks about a relationship between homeowners and tenants, which doesn't just see tenants as this little minority ghetto, but understands that, in any typical family, you're going to have homeowners and you're going to have tenants. And some of that will be about generations, but some of it will also just be about the different places in one family where people live. But you've got to start seeing working class families as a whole and treating those families as a whole. And if you do that, there's a principled way back, which, you wouldn't have to be a very left-wing Labour Party to be doing rather better, frankly, than they have been doing, or rather better than they're doing now.
We've come to the end of our hour, basically. I just wanted to finish with to give you a chance to sort of say, practically, what do you think people who are facing the kind of problems that you're facing, but maybe that you've talked about in the book, in terms of housing and employment, what's the kind of obviously, when you see people when they've come into a situation where they need legal representation, but more broadly than that, what can people do to help themselves?
The bottom line is to get organised. I've talked already about tenants unions, the different things you can do: pass on information, share knowledge, get organised collectively, potentially stop evictions. But there's loads of things before that. But it's very similar towards people in workplaces in terms of joining unions. Through my book, again, I talk about experiences like representing people in employment tribunals. I talk about what's happened to employment law, how the prospect of going to tribunals got more and more distant. It takes about 2 years now between someone being sacked and their case being heard. And that really puts a premium there for organising before people are sacked to stop them being dismissed. So whether it's tenants union, whether it's a normal union, number one, join it. But number two, get organised in it. Don't wait for someone else to be the answer. Don't think there's a lawyer. Don't even think there's an official who's going to deliver everything for you. Your union is as good as you and your work colleagues make it. Your tenants union is as good as you and the people make it. So it's not just a matter of joining, but getting involved, getting organised. And if that means that some people are kind of taking the law back into their own hands, getting resolution of disputes directly with their employer or landlord without needing to involve lawyers, this particular lawyer would actually be quite happy if that was the answer, because that's how people take back rights. They do it by doing themselves rather than waiting for someone else to come in and deliver it for them.
Yeah. Right. Well, Dave, thank you so much for coming on. By the way, I think you have your Lives Running blog, which I think people should really read. I mean, I read it regularly. I also read your Facebook posts, which are always very careful and detailed and useful. And I don't know how you have the patience sometimes, but the blog is
Thanks,
really
Ben, that's very sweet.
The blog is really useful and important. So please have a look at the Lives Running blog. You're also on Twitter under two separate accounts because you kind of split your roles in a way. So there's the Lives Running Twitter account, and then you also have one which talks specifically about your role as a in the legal profession as a barrister and so on, and all of the kind of legal campaigns that you're involved with, which is DK Renton. Is that right?
Yeah, it's at DK Renton. And listen, just before I go, Ben, I just want to say thanks so much for having me on. I've always, for many years, I've been following what you've been doing. Going back to we talked earlier about the Jeremy Corbyn stuff, and I'm really delighted that things like this take place. We've got to have a situation where there's a socialist, where there's a socialist net, where our ideas and our media, we're making them, and we're not dependent on the big social media giants, because we all know they'll allow us on for a bit, but they're never going to make Facebook or Twitter our space in the way that we need things to be our spaces. Yeah, and I think that's the idea behind Socialist Telly is just so simple in a way, and there's nothing flashy about it. It's not about making it
seem like we've got a 24-hour all singing, all dancing operation. What we've got is we've got sort of genuine activists that are talking to people continuously. And there's some really good stuff, but there's also Double Down News, there's Navarra, and so on. And this stuff is kind of happening now, and I think in some ways, I think certainly in terms of Socialist Telly, it's been in a reaction to the defeat, in a way, to say, look, we can't allow all of our voices to be filtered through that medium of mainstream media channels and so on. So I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the conversation, enjoyed it tonight. Could you just sort of say, because I know it's if people want to get hold of the book, where will they get it from?
Well, it's not in a lot of bookshops. If you just type in jobs and homes, maybe in speech marks, and then maybe Renton, that will get you it. The best place to get it from, I'd say, is directly from the Legal Action website. It might cost you 20p more than it would getting it from Amazon. Obviously, you can get it from Amazon too if you want. But the difference is that all the money will stay within the networks of people organising and people pushing for justice perspective. Whereas, frankly, if you get it from Amazon, why on earth does the people who've added, there've been days in the lockdown where the owners of Amazon have added £1 billion to their wealth. Why on earth would any of us need to make any of them any richer, frankly?
Yeah, and just to kind of so people understand, it's as far from a technical kind of legal book as you could get. So it's really kind of turned that on its head. So it's all about people. It's all about stories about and I think to be honest, Dave, it's a really fantastic kind of chronicle of lockdown as well, and of the the difficulties and the struggles that people have in lockdown. So you can read it on all sorts of different levels. But I think, I just want to make sure that people understand that it's not a tough read in terms of, I think it's really, really lovely, the way you've written it. It's really kind of empathetic, and so it's not, certainly not a kind of any kind of legal textbook or anything like that.
Not at all, Ben. And listen, that's really sweet of you, Sen. I really do appreciate it. But yeah, this is just a memoir of my life, of a year of my clients' lives, and a year of people's lives, just trying to fight back against the misery that's been locked down, and the misery that's what happens when employers and landlords get a bit out of control. That's all.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for coming on, Dave. And no doubt, we'll do something like this again. We can get you back on. Maybe we'll do a running special as well at some point. That would be nice.
I love that, Ben. And good luck with your own running. Yeah.
Yeah. Cheers. Thank you.